become catastrophically ill was Colin Norris.
But the police had to prove this was more than just coincidence. Over the next 2 years, they compiled more expert evidence. Each time they brought in Norris for questioning, he denied being involved. But on every occasion, he gave them fresh insights into his personality.
Colin Norris, to look at him, was quite a small, insignificant, really, I suppose, sort of slim fella. I found him quite a personable chap on some occasions to interview. He could be chatty, he could swap conversation with him, he was absolutely fine. And then, on the other hand, what I found very sinister about him was the fact that he couldn't remember these ladies, he had no empathy for them or their families, and the fact that he tried to sort of detach himself completely from any involvement with them, save to admit his entries in the patient notes, I found unbelievable, really.
But is there no one that can tell me, like your boss or anyone that can just tell me why I was arrested the first time?
Well, we're not going to get into a debate about that.
I'm not wanting a debate, I'm just wanting a straight answer.
Well, we're not going to go down this road.
Why not?
It's like, because I don't want to talk about this line of questioning.
But I want to talk about it.
We can talk
well, can you
about
get me your boss then?
We can talk about it at some future stage. When
what future stage? In another year and a half?
He did come across as very arrogant, very confident, and could be very, very aggressive in certain situations when he chose to be. There was one occasion when clearly he was becoming more and more agitated about our line of questioning because he wasn't answering the questions. He was trying to apportion blame to other nurses rather than answering the question he was being asked, and said, you know, I don't want to be interviewed anymore, and stood up and got very aggressive and had to be told to sit down and let's carry on with the interview.
Over the next few months, police carried out a painstaking analysis of staff rotas, phone records and personnel files.
Who had access to the wards? Who had access to insulin? Who was on the wards at the time of each and every one of these incidents and deaths? And it was a slow process of investigation, elimination, and building the information until it presented the compelling picture that there was only one person left standing on each and every occasion. That was Colin Norris.
Meanwhile, a picture of Norris was emerging that was at odds with the popular caring nurse he liked to portray himself as. Some elderly patients, like Eric Garside, had experienced his cruel streak.
He's got his medals on for British Legion. He's very proud. And he loved the grandchildren.
Dad was 87 years old when he had the fall. And he was very, very independent. He did everything, mostly everything for himself.
One evening, shortly after he had been admitted to hospital, Eric Garside asked staff nurse Colin Norris for some help.
He asked him if he would empty his catheter bag, and Colin Norris point blankly refused and said, you're quite able to do that yourself. The bathroom is at the top end of the ward. With that, Colin Norris then went off duty and left my dad to it. 10 minutes later, Dad had attempted to get out of bed and follow the instructions and had collapsed on the floor. He was very pale and thrashing his arms about, and so it was an ordeal for my dad. To think that, you know, these innocent elderly, mostly infirm patients were suffering at the hands of Colin Norris, it just makes me shiver.
Other elderly patients also described how Norris had treated them in an offhand and callous manner. Evidence of his apparent dislike of old people and his presence when each of the 5 victims was injected with insulin led police to interview him again. But his denials continued.
So the fact that I'm a nurse and I was in a hospital and someone died, that's the only thing that you've got?
When he kept telling me, is that all you've got? I kept saying to him, well, It's very, very damning that you are the only person on every occasion that's there within 2 hours. The suggestion that someone had come onto the ward during the night shift and gone onto a bay, injected a lady and snuck off there without anybody realising was just nonsense. It would mean that someone would be having to follow him round on each of these shifts to conduct these murders.
He had this arrogance and confidence that almost, you could see it at every turn. It wasn't a case of him more or less saying, I haven't done this. It was more a case of him saying, you will never prove this.
Well, I'm not going to admit to anything that I've not done, and I never murdered anybody, didn't inject anybody with anything. And I don't think their facts are good enough, I'm sorry.
But for detectives, those facts were good enough. After a 3-year inquiry, they finally believed there was sufficient evidence to charge him with 4 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. For Norris, the charges came as a shock.
He was so conceited all the time we were dealing with him, he never thought that it would get to that stage, I don't think.
Norris went on trial at Newcastle Crown Court in October 2007. After 5 years on bail, his normally calm exterior was starting to crack.
From his attitude when you watched him in court, and was stood up hammering on the windows at the judge, attacked some of the press when he came out of the court, it would appear he had a short temper. So don't know whether if somebody upset him, he would go off, in anger and do something. I don't know. But if he would attack people like the press outside when there's cameras about, what would he do on the ward?
Throughout the trial, Norris was confident he'd be acquitted. When the jury convicted him by 11-1, his reaction was one of disbelief.
Because we never had a witness saying they'd seen him coming out of one of the bays with a syringe in his hand, because we never had that evidence, and we had to work very, very hard to do the analytical work, to go through all the patient notes, to get the expert evidence all together. He never, ever in a million years thought that we would ever charge or convict him of this offence.
He thought, they haven't got that hard smoking gun piece of evidence that they need to convict me of these murders. What he didn't realise was that the evidence that was building in a circumstantial, compelling way that actually led to one conclusion and one conclusion only, that he had done it. And I think he was taken aback so much when the jury convicted him at the end of the day that it was the last thing he expected.
But questions remained. What made him do it? Was he motivated in the same way as Shipman? And would he have killed again? In March 2008, nurse Colin Norris was convicted of murdering 4 elderly patients and attempting to murder another. As no one had actually seen him deliver lethal injections of insulin as they slept, he thought he'd never be caught. But he was wrong.
He didn't see it as a suspect being seen with a smoking gun. But what we actually had was some hard evidence, which was a blood sample from a murder victim that was full of insulin, 1,000 units of insulin in that blood sample, which was just as good as. And that's what ultimately nailed him.
Like mass murderer Harold Shipman, who killed elderly patients with injections of morphine, Norris never showed any concern for his victims.
He never once said that he was sorry for what had happened to these ladies, never accepted that they'd been murdered, never had any compassion for the families at all, and was more concerned about how he'd been treated over the 2 years or 3 years of the investigation prior to our getting to a position where we could charge him.
You say I'm the common factor, so obviously you're blaming me for it. I'm the suspect. How did I do it? How am I supposed to have done it? Without anybody else noticing?
Neither Shipman nor Norris have ever admitted the guilt or responsibility for what they've done. And I think that reflects a similarity between both of them.